Hello YouTube, Bruno Luce here from GLB Productions. Welcome to this presentation, which as you can see is entitled A Brief History of Live Sound Reinforcement. Just to give you a little bit of background, this is something that I put together for a group of university students in Singapore. Generally speaking, when we train new sound engineers, this is a level of detail that we don't go into. But for this group of people, it struck me that as they are university students, they're absorbing information every day, they're in their adult formative years. Hopefully they can take this on not just as sound engineers to learn where their industry came from and perhaps where it is going, but also as part of their general education and also their knowledge about culture and popular music. So let's begin. In the beginning, as they say. It's important to understand that the principles of good acoustics have been understood for many centuries. Vitruvius, a Roman authority on architecture, wrote in 20 BC that by the rules of mathematics and the method of music, they sought to make the voices from the stage rise more clearly and sweetly to the spectators' ears. By the arrangement of theatres in accordance with the science of harmony, the ancients increased the power of the voice. And if you go to many Greek theatres, the example in this slide being from Epidaurus, you'll realize that they have truly excellent acoustics. On this particular one that you can see, the voice of a performer standing on the open-air stage here can be heard clearly in the back rows almost 60 meters away. Another account that I read states that the tearing of a piece of paper on the stage can be heard clearly in the back row. So it's clear that the science of acoustics is not a new one, and the Greeks were able to design structures that work together with the voices of actors to project and reinforce a live performance. However, we as modern sound engineers are mainly concerned with modern electrical PA systems. Now, all modern electrical PA systems have three basic building blocks. The first is a device to capture sound vibrations and convert them into an electrical signal, also known as a microphone. The second is a way of increasing and controlling the electrical signal, also known as an amplifier. And finally, a device to convert the electrical signal back into vibrations and propagate them, known as a loudspeaker. So, we have microphones, amplifiers, and loudspeakers. Of these three, the first to be invented was the microphone, and it was probably invented by David Edward Hughes in 1875. He coined the word microphone by thinking of it as the audio equivalent of a microscope. And in this slide, you can see a early carbon microphone of the same design as that which was invented by Hughes. His design used carbon granules packed between two metal plates, and that design, believe it or not, was used in telephones up until the 1980s. Secondly, we have the phonograph, which was invented by Thomas Edison in 1877. And this was the first device that was able to reproduce recorded sound. They actually were able to record sound before this, but the phonograph was the first device that was able to actually reproduce that sound. The modern moving coil loudspeaker was invented in 1898 by British physicist Oliver Lodge. And the issue at the time was that the amplifier had not yet been invented. So as a result, there were limited applications for this. Oliver Lodge referred to it as his bellowing telephone because he apparently used it to make his telephone louder. So we have the microphone and we have the loudspeaker. The final piece of the puzzle was the Audion, later known as the triode vacuum tube. This slide here shows the original Audion, which has been preserved in a museum, and the Audion was the first device capable of amplifying an electrical signal. This has, of course, evolved into the modern vacuum tube. You can see here a couple of 12AX7s or ECC83s, which are used as preamp tubes in guitar amplifiers, among others. So the vacuum tube is still very much with us, but when it was invented at the time, it was really the first electrical amplifier, the first way that people had of making an electrical signal bigger. So at this point, we have all three pieces of the puzzle in place. We have microphones, amplifiers, and loudspeakers. The first commercially available PA system was something called the Magnavox. And as you can see here, the microphone, which was referred to at the time as the transmitter, was almost the same size as the loudspeaker. In the center, you can see the power amplifiers, probably making about 10 watts at the time. And on the right, you have the loudspeaker. Now, the first documented instance of an electrical PA system being used to amplify speech, believe it or not, was 100 years ago at time of filming, and it was on the 24th of December 1915 in San Francisco, USA. The event was a Christmas Carol concert which included an address by the mayor. Now, it's important to understand that the PA systems of the time were tiny by today's standards. They only generated about 10 watts. But because of these large horn loudspeakers that you can see in the picture, the crowd of 100,000 people heard the Christmas music and speeches with absolute distinctness, according to newspaper reports of the time. So this is more or less the state of the art up to the end of World War II. You can see here, this is an advertisement from the 1930s for a Swedish PA system, which consists of a microphone and mic stand, the tube amplifier, and a loudspeaker. As you can see, the copy says 10 watts, high fidelity, 12-inch loudspeaker. I don't actually speak Swedish, so if anyone here can tell me what this means, I'd be grateful. And its use in live music consisted mainly of just amplifying the voice so that it could be heard over the rest of the instrumentation. And this type of vocal-only PA system is still used today for certain types of music, such as jazz and swing bands, where the instruments themselves, saxophones, trumpets, trombones, etc., are relatively loud. They don't need much help, but what does need help is the singer's voice. And this reflected the popular music of the time, the 20s, 30s, 40s, which consisted of big bands such as the one by Benny Goodman and Peggy Lee. And the way that they arranged things was they had a single microphone in front, and the singer would use the microphone when he or she was singing, and when they were finished, they would step away and sometimes allow a soloist, or in this case, the band leader, Benny Goodman, to take over. We now come to the post-World War II period, and it's extremely important to understand the cultural changes that were sweeping through the world during this time. Now, my father was born in 1940, and he grew up during the 50s. And the central figure of American popular music at that time was, of course, the young man who you see in the picture, Elvis Presley. And when I ask my father about that time, he remembers seeing Elvis live, and he remembers Blue Suede Shoes, Heartbreak Hotel, that kind of thing. But what he also remembers is the fact that the establishment hated this new kind of music not just because it was loud and it was rebellious sounding, but because it was fundamentally black music. You know, Elvis Presley was a white guy singing black music. If you go back and you look at the musicology, you'll realize that rock and roll is derived from blues, and blues, of course, is derived from the African slaves singing about their problems while doing their work so that they didn't feel so terrible about their life. And when somebody like Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry or that sort of thing started performing this music, the white establishment could not stand that. Now, why did they call it the music of the devil? Well, part of it was the fact that it was so different from the types of music that they'd heard during the 30s and 40s. But another major reason was the fact that this music used a completely different type of instrumentation to the dance bands and swing bands that had been so popular 10 years ago. The 1950s saw the invention of two major new instruments, the first being the solid body electric guitar, and more importantly, in 1951, the Fender Precision Bass, which was the first commercially successful solid body bass guitar. With these instruments, you could really have rock and roll take off. And the thing about rock and roll is that it was loud, and as a result, the vocals had to be louder to keep up. And the limited PA systems of the time simply could not do this without being pushed into distortion. And as bands pushed the limits and they had distorted vocals, people who heard this said, you know, that doesn't sound natural, that sounds awful. In fact, it sounds almost demonic. So that's where the term music of the devil came from, at least partly. And some manufacturers, they actually threatened to cut off retailers who sold their systems to bands who played the music of the devil. Most bands during this time carried their own small self-operated systems, which are essentially the types of systems that were prevalent during the 30s and 40s. In other words, small vocal amplifiers with, one or two microphones connected. The turning point came in 1965 when the Beatles played Shea Stadium in New York. The enormous popularity of the Beatles meant that they could play somewhere as large as a baseball stadium for the first time. So this is probably the first stadium gig ever. Up to this point, bands hadn't been able to fill a venue of this size. And the organizers brought in extra amplifiers, but unfortunately, the screaming of the crowd was so loud that the crowd couldn't hear the band, and the band couldn't hear themselves. Here's a color photograph, and I think the look on Paul McCartney's face pretty much says it all. He doesn't look like he can hear much of anything. And at this point, bands basically realized that something had to be done, or they would have to stop touring. It's very interesting to reflect on the fact that the Beatles more or less gave up touring after this concert. The album that was released after this was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is sort of a virtual band that would go out and tour in the form of a record release when the Beatles themselves could not, simply because they didn't have the technology to make themselves heard to these huge crowds. So if you had to give a date for the start of the modern sound reinforcement industry, it would be 1965, which coincidentally is the same as the founding of Singapore, of modern Singapore. So Singapore and the sound industry are the same age, easy to remember. So we now go into what I'm calling the golden age of sound. The rest of the 1960s saw PA systems increase both in power and fidelity. Charlie Watkins of WEM, which stood for Watkins Electric Music in London, came up with something called the Slave PA system in 1967. And the reason for that is that the amplifiers fed one another. So the idea being that they were cascaded together, and this helped to increase the volume of the sound. The system that he invented in 1967 used 10 amplifiers to generate 1,000 watts of power to 20 loudspeakers, which at the time was absolutely unprecedented. In 1968, WEM introduced the 5-channel Audio Master mixer. And it's interesting that this mixer has 5 channels, and I think you have bass, treble, and a spring reverb, and that's about it. And, although it's very, very rudimentary by today's standards, it was the first mixer that encouraged people to move away from the so-called set and forget operation. Up to this point, sound engineers, there were no sound engineers, there were roadies, and the musicians would balance their levels and then just leave them set during the concert. After this, you actually began to be able to mix in the modern sense of the word. And this mixer paved the way for the creation of the position of live sound engineer as distinct from roadie. Now, at the same time, you begin to have the development of low impedance microphones such as the Shure Unidyne 3, which you can see here. The SM57 was developed in 1965, and the SM58 was developed in 1966. And these microphones, for the first time, allowed relatively long cable runs, the use of a snake, meaning multi-core cable, that allowed the mixing console to be positioned centrally in the audience as opposed to at the side of the stage. At the same time, you have the development of higher power amplifiers. Crown was the first company to produce a commercially successful solid-state amplifier, this being the DC300 that was released in 1967. You could get tube amplifiers of this type of power, but they were incredibly heavy. The DC300 weighed less than a quarter of what an equivalently powered tube amplifier would. Now, what about loudspeaker systems during this period? Now, at the end of the 1960s, most live sound still used systems borrowed from cinemas, from motion picture theaters, and among the most popular were some of the ones that you see here, known as the Altec Voice of the Theater systems. Here's an A4, one of the most popular, and you can see that although it still looks something like a piece of Art Deco furniture, you are beginning to see the developments of the modern PA cabinet. So you have mid-range or woofers, you have porting, and you have a horn at the top. At the beginning of the 1970s, you have the development of the first multi-way PA systems, where the full range signal is split into bass, middle, and treble frequencies, which are then sent to separate amplifiers and loudspeakers. This allowed greater fidelity and higher volumes. This particular slide shows an early 1970s Hale or Heel sound system, and as you can see, they have large loudspeakers for the bass, then they have slightly smaller loudspeakers for the mid-range, and you have these horns for the treble. And when they loaded in with these systems, what they had to do was they basically stacked them up on either side of the stage, and in order to get the coverage right, they would have to manually aim these horns at the different parts of the venue. And from what I've read, most of the time, these systems didn't sound very good at all because of the interaction between and the phase cancellation of the different components. But for the time, it was revolutionary because they were loud and they actually allowed people to hear the music that was being played on stage. Here's a 1972 system for the Led Zeppelin tour of Australia, and you can see it's the same deal. You have large horn-loaded bass speakers, you have radial horn mid-range, and you have a multi-cell horn top end. These systems typically were either three-way, being split into bass, mid, treble, or more often four-way, with bass, a low mid-range, a high mid-range, and then a treble. Here is something which no review of the history of sound reinforcement could do without. This is the wall of sound which was designed for the Grateful Dead. Now, the wall of sound was interesting in that what it tried to do was to give each musician his own small PA system. So, for example, you can see this gentleman here playing guitar. All of these speakers behind him would be just for guitar. Over here, you have a piano, and maybe this set of loudspeakers here would be for the piano. And apparently, it sounded halfway decent when it was working. But just by looking at this picture, you can imagine the nightmare that it would be to set up. I mean, having to stack all of these cabinets individually, this flown center section, and just all of the cabling, the possibilities for miswiring, it being out of phase, and it never really caught on, shall we say. The other interesting thing about the wall of sound that you're immediately would probably wonder is, how did they stop the vocals from feeding back? And the answer is that they came up with a very ingenious cancellation system. You can see that on these microphone stands there are actually two microphones, and they are wired of opposite polarity. And what that did was it allowed the vocal mics to operate in front of the PA system without constantly feeding back. Here's something that's called the 36 kilowatt flying system. It's a UK system, and this probably reflects the state of the art towards the end of the 1970s. So you can see a couple of important developments. The first is we begin to see monitor wedges on stage for the first time. Up to this point, the musicians either just relied on the sound that came back from the main PA, or they actually turned, they had speakers at the side of the stage which reproduced the main mix, because at that time mixing consoles didn't have aux sends and they didn't have the ability to generate a separate monitor mix for each performer. The other thing is the idea of flying part of the system to get better coverage was catching on at this point. So we now move into the 1980s, and a British company called Turbo Sound begins to produce what we call an exploded array, which is still a point source, but the important thing is that we begin to see what looks like a modern PA system. So you can see that each of these boxes, we're no longer talking component systems where you have separate bass, mid, treble. This box here would typically be a full range loudspeaker. In other words, you'd have mid and treble in the same box. You can see these small ones would be downfill. In other words, these are to provide coverage to the very front of the audience. And the concept with all of this is that the ones at the top of the array would cover the furthest seats, these would cover the seats in the middle, and this would cover the closer seats. In the late 80s, one of the most popular cabinets that was used was the EAW KF850. This was one of the first trapezoidal cabinets. As you can see, the cabinet is actually shaped such that it nests together, and that's how you derive the coverage angles for the array. And this cabinet was very, very popular for a number of years. Here finally is a late 80s, early 90s PA system, a turbo sound flashlight system, and you can see the full range loudspeakers at the top augmented by subwoofers down at the bottom. Many of this type of PA system are still in use today simply because they didn't sound terribly bad. And then finally we move into the 1990s, and in 1993 Christian Hale and the French company Acoustics developed the first modern line array system. And the concept of the line array is that it uses constructive interference between all of these boxes to achieve more efficient distribution of the sound energy. The idea is to focus the sound energy on the audience as opposed to spraying it all over the venue on wall, ceiling, and that kind of thing. So when you see one of these line arrays, typically what you'll see is this will be the main array, this is subwoofers, and below you can see a smaller line array that's hung as a downfill to cover the very front of the audience. You can also just see in this picture you have arrays that are hung at the side to cover the sides of the audience, and finally you have subwoofers stacked on the ground. It still helps to have the subs on the ground to augment the low frequency of the system. Here's a side view of the same array. You can see this J shape, and the idea being that although you have multiple boxes in the array itself, what comes out of the array is supposedly a single coherent sound wave. In practice, this often does not happen because of the way in which the array is hung. It requires very complex computer modeling to get this right, and a difference of even 1 or 2 degrees in the angle of hang can create a bad sound. And in Singapore we hear lots of these line array systems that just don't sound very good, and usually it's because of the way that they're set up. Finally, over the last 10 years we've seen a huge proliferation, development, and general acceptance of digital mixing consoles. This is a Midas Pro 6, as well as the emergence of network audio. By converting sound into digital signals and transmitting it over standard Ethernet cabling, the process of distributing high-quality audio through a system or venue has been greatly simplified. You don't have to run copper everywhere. All you do is you use the existing network cabling within the building. And needless to say, this also has meant the gradual demise of the traditional copper multi-core snake. What happens now is the signal is converted to digital at the stage box, and the stage box on is all Cat5 or network cabling. In fact, nowadays you even have loudspeakers and amplifiers that accept a digital signal, and this has reduced the number of DA/AD conversions that you have to do, and reduced system propagation time, meaning the amount of time that the signal takes to go from the beginning to the end of the system. So that's a very brief history of live sound reinforcement. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. References and works cited are in the description of this video. I'm particularly grateful to Andy Coules from Pro Sound Web for writing the 2 articles that you can see there on which the structure of this presentation is based. This is Bruno Luce from GLB Productions. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.